Greetings to all my friends in the Right of Center Underground Railroad. Well, we've got a lot of shooters and quite a few new shooters, so I decided to put together some tips that'll really get you on the fast track to seeing some remarkable progress the very next time you get to the range. Now, how are we going to do that? Simple. Instead of giving you a list of sequential instructions on how to shoot, I'm going to focus in depth on the 3 biggest mistakes that any of us ever make when we shoot. And believe me, everybody makes them because they're perfectly natural to make. Alright, the nice thing is that shooting really is 95% mental. So if you're willing to step out in the weeds for a little bit, really intellectualize why it's natural to make these mistakes, it's the only tool that you need to fix them or avoid them in the first place. Now before we get started, let's quickly go through the 4 basic rules of gun safety. If you've heard them before, listen to them again. Horowitz did his Hannon exercises, right? Okay. Rule number 1, every firearm is loaded until you yourself have determined that it is not. Okay, if a buddy goes to hand you a gun, hey, check out my new 9mm. If you're not perfectly familiar with that type of gun, just stop. Don't get nervous. Just simply say, show me how to check it. That way the 2 of you will go through the whole manual of arms and everybody will know that that gun is unloaded. Okay, but assume every gun is loaded until you yourself have verified that it isn't. Alright, otherwise just don't touch it. Rule number 2, keep that muzzle pointed in a safe direction always. Don't even let it momentarily pass in an unsafe direction. Okay, if you were standing in front of me and I turned this way, that muzzle would sweep by your feet. Well, I'm always going to pull it in tight this way, okay? Now, one thing about Rule 2, though, when we're on a range, the only direction deemed safe is, of course, downrange. Alright? No one handles a firearm behind the line. This is very important. You're going to go to the firing line, uncase your gun on the line, do your shooting. If you want to take a break between strings, you can leave the action open, set it down facing downrange, or you can holster the thing downrange, or you can put it back in its case. Then you can turn and you can leave the line. Very important. Range officers have to assume that no one has good gun handling techniques, right? So they have to be able to look back and forth down the line and immediately see anything that's out of order. So no one handles a firearm behind the line when we're on a shooting range, okay? Now, rule number 3. A lot of people say this one should be rule number 1. Keep your finger off the trigger until you are actually ready to fire the gun. Folks, guns do not go bang by themselves. Just about every gun has passive safeties. Even this revolver, the lockwork in it's 100 years old. But even if I dropped it cocked right on the hammer, it would not fire unless that trigger is held to the rear. They do not go off unless somebody pulls the trigger. So, if you don't want to hear a bang, don't touch the trigger. That's rule 3. Now, rule 4. This one's very important. Be sure of your target, what's around it, and what's beyond it. Now on the range this takes care of itself, of course, but in the rest of the world it does not matter if we're plinking at cans with our buddies out in the boondocks or whether we're defending ourselves at 2 a.m. in a parking lot, alright? You and I are 100% responsible for every bullet that we fire, okay? Things that miss or over-penetrate. Look, if you do damage to property or, God forbid, hurt another innocent person, all right, you may not be charged if it was a justifiable shooting, but you will be sued and you will quite properly lose. And you know why. I have a right to defend myself, but I have no right to expect any innocent third party to bear any cost of that. Okay? You are responsible for every bullet you fire. So, please keep that in mind. Very, very important. All right, let's get to the fun part. Okay, we got 3 mistakes and a lot of ground to cover. We're going to start with the sights. For the new shooters, we'll just run through the basics fairly quickly. As I'm sure you know, you have a square notch in the back and a post in the front. And what we want to do is we want to have that post centered within the notch and have it even across the top. Just like that, as I'm looking at the camera here. Now the bullets are going to hit where the tip of the front sight is on the target at a given distance, assuming we do our part. Now we're actually trying to line up 4 things: our eye, the rear sight, the front sight, and the target. Now the first problem we run into is that your eye can only focus at one distance at a time. I can look at this finger, I can look at this finger, I cannot see both of them clear and sharp. Now every one of us wants to focus on the target. Okay, we want to see it crystal clear because we also want to see the results of our shooting. This does not work. It is very important that we focus our eye on the tip of the front sight, okay, instead of the target. And the reason for that is actually just very simple geometry. Because if you look at those 4 things that we're trying to line up, Okay, the shortest distance between any of them is the distance between these sights here. Okay, so mistakes over this short distance, the short radius of arc it's called, are going to make far more difference on the target than if all of this is maintained all the way back and I just happen to wobble a little bit. See, if I wobble a little bit with everything in a straight line, then I'm only going to be off the mark just by a little bit. But if I make the mistake here in the sights, you see, just moving the muzzle about the same amount by twisting my hands instead, now I miss the entire target. Alright, so we have to focus on the front sight. That means your rear sight is going to be a little bit blurry, the target's going to be really blurry. Okay, so now you want to ask, how in the world does anybody shoot these tight clusters of shots if the target is a big fuzzy blob? Well, it's actually pretty simple. It's because the center is always the center. Now, our brains have a marvelous ability for recognizing symmetry and finding the center of things. Okay, and it doesn't matter if it's as small as a lifesaver, or as big as a beach ball, if it looks crisp and sharp, or whether it's all fuzzy around the edges. Right? The center is still the center. Alright, so here's where you can really trust the geometry. Keep your eye focused on that front sight. Do your mental housekeeping here, where it's going to make the biggest difference, right? And put that tip of the front sight on what you perceive to be the center of the target you're trying to hit, and you'll be just fine. But that brings us to our first huge mistake. Now, everybody tells you to focus on your front sight. Focus on the front sight. Focus on the front sight. You'll get to the range. If I'm with you, maybe you're loading up for that first shot, I'll tap you on the shoulder and say, remember, focus on your front sight. So I have every confidence that's exactly what you're going to do. You're going to raise the gun, you're going to bear down on that front sight, you're going to fire the shot, and then you're going to reflexively want to look up. You're going to want to peek to see where those bullets go. No, 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 no. No peeking. Why? Who goes to the range, fires one shot, and goes home? Now, we shoot groups of shots, strings of shots. Okay? When you shoot the CCW qualification, as an example, there are stages where you're going to shoot, depending on the type of gun you have, they'll have you fire 5 or 6 rounds, then reload the gun, and then do it again. Okay? If you come off that front sight between shots, what happens? First, you just wasted the time that it takes to focus your attention on the target where we know it cannot possibly be, right? But then, once you see where that bullet went, if it didn't go quite where you wanted it to, you can't fix it, you can't take it back. All you can do is get pissed off. Now you're distracted, and here is the point. If you peek to see where those bullets are going in the middle of a string, it is very likely that your eyes are going to stay out there for the rest of the string. That means that every subsequent shot is going to be as bad or worse than the one that pissed you off when you peeked. Alright? So stay on that front sight until you are done. In fact, I want you to do this with even one shot. Alright? If you're doing a single shot drill, come up, fire the shot, make sure you're still looking at your front sight. Then take your finger off the trigger and the gun comes down and you can look at the target and see where you hit. Believe me, this whole thing about peeking, I mean, if you want to really learn to shoot tight clusters, don't come off that front sight between shots. That way you will be looking at the same sight picture every time. Believe me, those 2 words, no peeking, are an epic tip. You can thank me later. The other 2 mistakes we make relate to the mechanics of shooting. The first one is jerking the trigger, and second is anticipating the recoil, flinching. Now, when you jerk the trigger, generally it's going to throw your shots wide, left or right. Most people pull them to the inside when they jerk the trigger, to the left for a right-handed shooter. But depending on how you're holding the gun, this is an example, if instead of having the pad of my finger square on the face of the trigger like this, if I let too much of my finger come through, well, you can see it's easy to torque them to the outside as well. Alright? But suffice it to say, if your shots are going significantly wide of the mark, it's because you're jerking the trigger. Now, if your shots are going really low on the target, it's because you're anticipating the recoil, you're flinching. What's happening is, just at the moment you think that gun is going to go off, you're tensing up and pushing on it. And in reality, what happens is, you start that entire process, the gun starts moving downwards, it actually goes off a couple of hundredths of a second later, that throws the shot right into the dirt, and then the recoil kind of masks that flinch. In fact, it's very tough to spot, even for coaches, unless you've seen it a lot of times, to see that muzzle take a little nosedive before the recoil masks that flinch. Generally easier to diagnose just by seeing low shots on the target. Ah, you're flinching. Alright, so let's deal with the recoil first. Now, most shooters are concerned with recoil, especially in the beginning. It doesn't take very many shots to realize that it does not hurt. In fact, I've seen 100-pound women shoot 45s and 357s and sometimes above without ever describing the recoil sensation as actually being painful or causing any discomfort. It's startling and it's distracting until you get used to it. But the best thing you can initially learn to do is nothing. Now, this is easier said than done, but what I mean is that we don't want to react at all with our hands and our wrists. Okay, whatever tension we have in our hands and arms all the way up through our shoulders, we just want to hold it there and press that trigger, let the gun move all at once, and then resight. Another thing I find is a lot of people with a flinching problem might already be holding the gun too tightly, because remember, we're trying to fight it, we're trying to stop the gun from kicking. This really isn't necessary at all, just nice and firm, like a good handshake, or like holding a hammer or a garden tool. Alright, and again, whatever tension I have in my hands and arms, alright, I just want to hold it there. Just take a deep breath, let everything settle down, and then just press that trigger. Let the gun move all at once, and then resight. Once you can do that reliably, then we can talk about some techniques for some quick follow-up shots and what we do after that. But we first must have to learn to ignore that recoil before we can actually start recovering from it. So I'll have some drills down at the end. And in fact, the next tip, as we get to the trigger, is going to help with that as well. Now, I've saved trigger control for last, because what I like to call trigonometry really is the be-all and end-all of this game. Our sights don't have to look absolutely perfect, just good enough for the shot we're making, right? In a defense situation, we're talking about hitting a salad plate, say, at maybe 15 or 20 feet maximum most of the time. Sights don't have to look quite perfect for that. We have to look at them to hit the target. But I'll tell you now, if you get too rough on the trigger, you can miss an entire man-sized target inside 10 feet. It happens all the time in gunfights. So this is where we're really going to have to step out in the psychological weeds for a little bit and understand why we do this. Stick with me. It results in the best tips I can give to any shooter at any level. Okay, here we go. The reason we quite naturally want to jerk the trigger is because of the way our brains interpret the sights. Remember what I was saying about our ability to recognize symmetry, find the center of things? Well, as obvious as it is to our eye when things are out of alignment, things are even more obvious when it's all in alignment, okay? It's a visual cue. It's like a light bulb going on in your head. Now think about it for a second. If I'm focusing all of my attention on lining this stuff up, it almost doesn't matter how much I might be shaking or wobbling. You can bet for tiny fractions of every second I'm holding that gun, those sights are just going to kind of float into perfect alignment momentarily. When that happens, that light bulb goes on. Your brain screams now, and you try and grab all the way through the trigger. Congratulations, you just took out the rack of Red Bull instead of the miscreant with the gun standing 2 feet to the right of it. Now obviously we want to teach ourselves to avoid that visual cue when it happens. But more than that, what we really need to do is to avoid the tendency to want to make the gun go off at an exact instant in time, okay? Because you're always going to be behind the curve. Alright, this is what causes us to jerk the trigger. And parenthetically, when we were talking about recoil before, think about it. If I'm trying to make the gun go off at an exact instant in time, I am much more likely to fight it at that point. So we have to avoid that tendency entirely. What we want is what shooters call a surprise break to the trigger. And just as a quick example, when I say go, I'll start squeezing here. Ready? Go. Squeeze, 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 squeeze. See? It goes off somewhere in the middle of the word squeeze. That's what we need to do every time we're lining up the gun. Alright, now I find the best way to get you to do that is for me to blow apart the biggest misconception in all of shooting. Stay with me. This is where it gets good. Because of the way shooting is most often taught, many people, most people in fact, have the impression that the process of firing an accurate shot is to align the sights as precisely as possible, then squeeze the trigger smoothly enough that we don't disturb those sights. I'm here to tell you that absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing. Why? Because the gun is always moving, right? Even if you have nerves of steel, haven't had coffee in 6 months, you would still see your pulse beat slightly in the sights. That gun is always moving. Just the very idea that we're going to line these sights up, and when we think they're perfect, we're going to freeze them there, then we're going to start loading up the trigger without disturbing these sights? Sure. Those sights left the mark an hour and a half ago. No, here's the truth. Sight alignment and trigger squeeze are not and can never be a sequence. One follows the other. No, that final bit of sight alignment and the trigger squeeze must happen simultaneously and continuously until after the gun fires. Now that simultaneous process of both final sight alignment and trigger squeeze are going to result in a couple of things. First of all, most of the time it means that your shots are going to break with the sights just a hair off center, but we've already been through that. We don't have to have the sights perfect, just good enough, and we have to avoid yanking the trigger. But the other things it means work to your advantage as soon as you realize what I'm really getting at here, because it means that I don't have to waste any physical energy, mental energy, or any time getting those sights to look perfect before beginning that final process of making the shot. Now what I'm getting at here is that I see new shooters, in fact a lot of shooters, will hang out that gun and they're waiting for everything to look perfect. They're holding it and no, not quite there, almost, yeah, here, no. And the longer you're holding that gun, the more tired you're going to get, the more you're going to start to shake, right? And at some point that visual cue cuts in, oh there it is, and you just spent 10 or 15 seconds yanking the trigger and missing the target, okay? Here's where you can think of shooting as a sequence of two processes. One, presentation. Two, delivery. Alright, now we obviously begin the process by looking at the spot that we want to hit. Alright, so on presentation of the gun, the only thing I'm doing, the only energy I'm spending, is to make sure that I transfer my focus from the spot that I want to hit onto the front sight where it belongs. Alright, I'm not particularly worried about having them perfect. But then as things steady down and my brain says go, when I choose to make the shot, I bear down on this front sight and I drive that front sight where it needs to go while I squeeze the trigger. Okay, let me do that again. I've got coarse sight alignment, go, drive and squeeze. Right? See what's happening here? Now you notice I'm doing it with this long double action trigger so that you can actually see me thinking. Let me do it single action, you'll see that the result is about the same. Okay, up, nice and relaxed, okay, go, drive and squeeze. Now you see how that takes about the same amount of time? Now this is for a very precision shot. Even a fine shot like that, the actual process should only take a second or two. If it takes much longer than that, you're holding the gun too long or you're not doing these things simultaneously. Now let's take that one step further. Remember, we have presentation and then delivery. Alright? So let me do that again and then stop in the middle of the procedure. Watch this. Presentation, stop. Now right there I just took a mental snapshot of what the sights looked like when I raised the gun. And that time, as the gun came up on target and I focused on the front sight, that sight was about here. It was about half of it was high of the notch and it was all the way to the left side. Alright, here's my point. This is more than close enough to begin that final process of making the shot. Drive and squeeze, pop. That's what you want to happen every time. Okay? So, notice now I don't have to wait for everything to be perfect. I just have to wait for them to be close enough, and then I drive and squeeze, pop. That's how it's done. Now let me make a bold prediction here. You newer shooters, as soon as you start putting these concepts together, number one, seeing that final process of fine sight alignment and trigger squeeze happening together, right? Not wasting any energy and time until things steady down, then we say go. Combine that with not peeking between shots, and some of you shooters, some of the newer shooters are going to go to the range, you are going to shrink your groups in half. But even better, you're going to achieve that accuracy by shooting 2, 3, 4 times as fast as you were shooting before, because you're not going to be waiting anymore. You're going to come up, okay, on the target, bear down and squeeze. All right, bear down and squeeze, bear down and squeeze, bear down and squeeze. This is what's going to start happening. And you're going to start tearing the center out of the target. All right, let's finish this up with a couple of simple drills you can do at home. Now, obviously this is dry firing, so all our rules of gun safety are in full effect. Make sure your gun is unloaded, check it, double check it, triple check it, and then make sure you're pointed at something that'll stop a bullet, okay? The first drill is very simple. It's just getting that process, that final sight alignment and the trigger squeeze to happen together. All right. Now, if you have a double action trigger, I want you to use the long, heavy double action trigger. This is opposite what most people teach. The reason is most people, if you jerk the trigger, you will disturb the gun less with a single action than you will with a double action. But you see, what I want you to do is get used to that process of driving that sight through the trigger pull. That makes all the difference. All right, so what we want to do is just take a deep breath and relax. Course sight alignment, remember, we're not spending a lot of energy. Then my brain says, go, and I drive that front sight and squeeze. All right. We want to make sure that that muzzle is not twitching when the hammer falls. One more time. And in fact, you know, I find sometimes if you use breathing, in other words, on an exhaling breath, again, this is opposite what a lot of people teach. They tell you to stop breathing, hold your breath when it's time to shoot. I think you're going to get a better result if you do it on an exhaling breath, at least for this type of exercise. So what I want you to do is go, once you got the gun up, go. See what's happening? Once you can get that to happen consistently, then you can add the presentation to the target. And there's a lot more going on here than you see initially. But what I want you to do is start with your finger off the trigger and the gun down, looking at the spot that you want to hit. Okay? Then we come up, get on that front sight, then bear down and squeeze. Simple as that, right? Come up, get on that front sight, bear down and squeeze. Now let's break that down. Again, I'm starting with my finger off the trigger, my hands together. I'm looking at the spot that I want to hit. All right. As the gun comes up, about here, it's coming up. The gun is level with the ground, coming up on the target. This is where my finger goes to the trigger. All right. Now, at this point, now the gun is just a couple of inches below that spot that I want to hit. I want to make sure I transfer my focus to the front sight where it belongs. Okay, so that everything comes up, comes into line, and then bear down and squeeze. Right? So there's a lot going on there. As far as safety, you have to keep your finger off the trigger until you're on your way to the target here, and make sure you get on that front sight, and then bear down and squeeze. Very simple. Come up, bear down and squeeze. That's how it's done. Another drill you can do is going to help you with the presentation of the target. All right. Let's get our sights on the target, then close your eyes, lower the gun, then raise the gun and open your eyes. Where are those sights? Are they close enough to begin that final process of making the shot? See, once you develop that muscle memory, those sights are going to snap almost right on the target. And as I said before, as soon as they're close, I can begin that process, drive and squeeze, and get it done. All right? So this is a really interesting drill, and it just helps with muscle memory. Sight the gun, relax. Okay? Finger off, gun down, eyes closed. Bring the gun up, now take a look again. Am I close enough to begin that process? Well, that's certainly enough to absorb for one lesson, okay? Just try and put those concepts together. All right? The idea of getting that final sight alignment and the trigger squeeze happening together, and not coming off the sight between shots. That is going to make one hell of a difference regardless of what level you are as a shooter. Okay? So we'll see you on the range, and if anybody wants to get together and do some shooting, please don't even hesitate to call me. I love it, especially if you're a beginner. All right? So take care of my friends in the right of center underground, and we'll see you soon.